Hello and welcome to the state of preprinting. This is a talk to go alongside a report that is also going to be released at the same time. This is very much scratching the surface of the data in the report, but I do expect this to be relatively long because there was a lot of data to get through. I'm Johnny Coates, Executive Director at Rippling Ideas. Follow me, ask me questions. I'm always happy to discuss anything preprinting. So let's just dive straight in. So today we're releasing an in-depth report. We're releasing code and analysis to go with that report. And we've also created a little R package to make life a little bit easier. And of course, these slides and this talk are going out. Before we get into this, I just want to do a quick overview of the data that is actually going to be included in all of this. So we've got data from Europe PMC covering all the preprints that they index between 2013 and 2025. Got bioRxiv and medRxiv data, and this is preprint metadata, preprint review data, published data, summary usage reports, huge amount of data in that. We've used OpenAlex to get bioRxiv citation data, and we've also got altmetric data. So far in this talk, it's only going to be bioRxiv data for that, but in the report, there will be a little bit more. Really important to mention though that the data is taken as is from each source. The work does not compare the sources, and we do know that there are gaps within all of these. So for example, EuropeMC does not index every preprint server. We know that the data matching between preprints and their published versions for bioRxiv is not 100%. So there is some little bits that are missing, but on the whole, this should provide a really good overview of the current preprint landscape. And so what does that look like from a high level perspective? In 2025, we passed over 1 million life science preprints as indexed by EuropeMC. You can see that the COVID-19 pandemic did have quite a big impact here. It really did help boost the use of preprinting, but even since then, this has continued to grow as a practice. Unfortunately, this practice remains dominated by traditional publishers. So you can see here, Research Square currently hosts the most number of preprints. However, bioRxiv is not that far behind, and certainly going through 2026, we expect to see this kind of change a little bit. Research Square submissions have slowed down quite rapidly throughout 2025, whereas bioRxiv is continuing to grow. Preprint adoption is continuing, as I said, and it is growing, but it is not a normalized practice. In fact, it's quite far from that. You're seeing here the percentage of literature associated with a preprint in each year. We go back to 2017 here. And roughly around 11 to 12% of the literature is associated with a preprint for biomedicine. That's enough that this isn't a practice that is going to suddenly disappear and go away, but this is certainly not a normal practice. And preprints utilize predominantly open licenses. This is great. One of the things that often comes up with preprints is that they might be accessible, but they're not open if they don't have an open license. This shows that for the most part, preprints do have open licensing. However, this varies greatly by the preprint server chosen. And what you're seeing here with Research Square, for example, they mandate CC BY licensing, and that comes across in the data, whereas bioRxiv give authors the choice of preprint license, and that choice tends to lead to more restrictive licenses. This really highlights the need for much greater training and advocacy when authors are going to be given a choice. People are also using preprints an awful lot. Preprint citations skew heavily towards bioRxiv, so it might not be the biggest server by number, but it is a really big hitter in terms of impact. So what you're seeing are the cumulative citations over time for each of these preprint servers, and bioRxiv really does just completely lead. So let's take a deeper dive on the OpenArchive servers. So these are bioRxiv and medRxiv. Both servers are continuing to grow. They did hit a peak at the pandemic, which then at the years since started to slow down. However, since 2022, they've really started to increase in their usage again. In 2025, bioRxiv hit 50,000 preprints in that year. That's a new preprints. medRxiv is used a lot less. This is very much a clinical thing. Clinicians are generally a bit slower to adopt preprinting, but you can see that both servers are on very much an upward trajectory and continuing to grow. The other thing that both servers have is they're really contributing to views and downloads. So this suggests people are really heavily using these servers. Collectively, they have over 1 billion views and downloads together, and they passed that back in 2023. bioRxiv alone hit 1 billion views and downloads in 2025. And so again, it's not just growth in people posting preprints, but it's growth in people using those preprints. And I really want to focus this talk on bioRxiv. It's been around since 2013, so there's quite a lot of data to talk about now. And there's also a lot of data available. So it's a good case study in a preprint server. Although the preprint adoption is growing, it really does vary quite broadly by field. Some fields actually appear kind of stalled. So what you're seeing here are the number of preprints posted each year over time and the category that they're posted in. Neuroscience has very, very quickly adopted preprinting and really grown and is actually doing really great in terms of preprint use. That's followed by microbiology and bioinformatics, both at kind of similar levels. Cell biology then leads what would be the rest of the pack. And I think this is really a testament not to cell biologists, but to the advocacy efforts around cell biology. There's been a lot of effort, a lot of the big preprint advocates are actually cell biologists. And I think that's why this category, amongst the rest of them here, is kind of leading the way. What's really important to mention here, though, is that a lot of these lower level categories do appear kind of stalled. They're not necessarily growing. Developmental biology, you can see, is kind of a flat line, really. This highlights that we need quite desperately to do a lot more advocacy around preprint adoption, and we really need to do this field by field because this is not a normal practice at all. And as I've already mentioned, most bioarchives do have a restrictive license. So most of them actually choose the most restrictive license of CC BY NCND. And this really comes down to authors not quite understanding what the licenses mean for them. And so we do need to better educate authors, and we do need stronger advocacy and training, not just around licensing, but around anything where authors are going to be given a choice. But the licenses do appear to be slowly opening up. So more recently, bioRxiv switched the order in which authors are presented with the license choices. So maybe that's why we're seeing an increase in CC BY. But whatever the reason is, in 2025, we had the best year in terms of percentage of preprints on bioRxiv having a CC BY or a public domain license. So if that trend continues into 2026 and onwards, we are starting to see a bit of a shift there. Most bioRxiv preprints also exist as a single version. We talk a lot about the possibility of preprints to provide iterative science or to allow you to update what you're doing. And actually, most people don't seem to use that. So less than 25% of preprints are revised more than once. This is something that is quite an interesting bit of the data for me because I've previously done a study looking at iterative preprints, and they're very, very difficult to identify. And they really are, they're a tiny percentage. Out of interest, the preprint with the most revisions has been revised about 26 times, which is a lot. bioRxiv preprints have also collectively received over 1.3 million citations, and this again continues to be growing. You would expect a bit of a drop off in the data for 2025 because things take time to accumulate citations, but I would expect this trajectory to very much continue throughout the next few years. This really does just show that people are using preprints actively in their research. And like I said already, just bioRxiv alone in 2025 cumulatively reached over 1 billion views and downloads. This isn't just scientists using these servers. We know from data, again, that I previously did during the pandemic, that it wasn't just scientists. So it was policymakers, it was the general public, journalists, a lot of people are using preprints. And since 2020, the use of preprints really has remained quite high. We're seeing that most of these views do come from the abstracts, which is a really important point when thinking about what we include in the abstracts, what kind of data and words we use in particular, and how that might impact readers. We need to be a little bit more careful, I think, with some of the hyperbolic language used. And we do need to appreciate that the abstract is the thing that gets the most read. However, what's really nice to see in this data is a fairly good conversion between the abstract views and the full text views or PDF downloads. And like I said, it's not just scientists doing this. So bioRxiv preprints are discussed across the world. What you're seeing here is the total number of mentions based on altmetric data, colored by geographical region. Most of this is still very much Northern America and Western Europe, but you can see that actually it is spread globally, which is quite nice to see. And this is that data, but country level. So by far, it is the US leading this kind of data. And if we look at this altmetric score, the distribution of the altmetric scores by the bioarchive category, you would unsurprisingly see that for the most part, the average score is not that high. There are quite a lot of outliers in some of these. A lot of the outliers, I will say, are COVID-related work that really did lead to quite a seismic shift in how preprints are being used. But what is actually I find really interesting is developmental biology here has the highest average altmetric score for the preprints in that category. And I'm not entirely sure why. But this is led by categories that you'd kind of expect. And it's not just people talking about them. Preprints are covered by news organizations also across the world. So what you're seeing here again is altmetric data, and there have been almost 200,000 news stories across 129 different countries. So again, it's a very much a global effort here. Most of those mentions are actually in microbiology and immunology. Again, that does come back to the pandemic because these were two really big categories during that period. But it's not just those categories, and it's not just pandemic research that's being mentioned. You can see every category here pretty much has at least some news mentions. Evolutionary biology is quite high on the list, which is kind of surprising. But we've got genomics, bioinformatics, ecology. They're all getting mentioned, and that's really interesting because it suggests that preprints are having a much wider impact than just scientific use. This did peak very much during the pandemic, but you can see that it hasn't gone back to zero. It is still happening, just on a much reduced level. This is not surprising. Most journals do like to wait for the peer-reviewed published, but they are still using preprint. Preprints are also being used in policy documents. Not on the same scale, but you can see that there's been 8,800 policy mentions across 41 different countries. Again, it's very much the US and Europe who are leading these kind of mentions, but it's not exclusively those countries. Mostly microbiology and immunology, also ecology here, which I think makes sense in terms of what you would expect in ecology and how that would relate and translate over to policy. A lot of this does come from the pandemic still, but you can see in the data that it's not just categories that are related to the pandemic. Collectively, all of this usage did peak in 2021. You can see the impact of the pandemic in this data, but I don't want to keep mentioning the pandemic. The other thing that's really interesting in this is that the levels are still very high. You're getting almost 500,000 mentions a year. And the big change here from 2024 is that across 2025, we really saw Blue Sky growing as the place to discuss preprints on social media. We can also look at where these preprints are published, and you can see that they're published in a wide variety of journals. What you're seeing here are just venues that have over 1,000 preprints each, and that is very, very much led by eLife and Nature Comms. You can also see the average time between preprint posting and publication. Most are published within 3 to 12 months. The average is around 255 days. That's higher than other estimates of this data, but like I said, this is just relying on what we have within bioRxiv. We're not looking at other sources for this. And everyone wants to know about Cell Nature Science, so let's pull that out of the data. In Cell, it takes 623 preprints so far. Nature has taken 863 that they've published, and Science has taken 661 that they've published. And we can also look at the delay in these three big journals. Cell's average delay is 289 days, Nature's 338 days, and Science has 272 days. Remember, the average overall was 255 days, so these big journals are taking a lot longer to publish those bits of research compared to the average. So have a very quick look at medRxiv. There's a lot more in the report, so I'm going to be fairly light in this analysis. Similar to bioRxiv, preprint posting really does differ quite a lot by field. The fields that I've pulled out here are the ones that are very much largely were involved with the pandemic related fields, and you can see again that massive peak in 2020. These are still growing, which is great. You can see public and global health really is upwards trajectory, but a lot of the medRxiv categories are very much still and not heavily used. This really does indicate a need for much greater engagement with the clinical communities. Most medRxives are published in PLOS One by quite a long way, but you can see again we've got a range of journals in which these preprints are eventually published, and very much to the bioRxiv data, it's between 3 to 12 months that most of these are actually published. Let's look at preprint peer review. This is a really big growing space at the moment. There are currently around 20 active preprint peer review platforms that range from quite minimalist expressions and ways of doing things, right through to very journal-like ways of doing it. So eLife is the classic journal-like example. Social media posts are the classic example on the other way, where it's not very formal, but they can actually be proper peer review. We do have a list of these preprint review services on our website, which gives you a lot more information about them if you want to find that. Evaluation of preprints generally is actually quite low. So this is EuroPMC data, and 97% of the preprints on EuroPMC are not associated with an evaluation. We can break that down by category, and again, you'll see that bioRxiv has about 4.3% that are evaluated, medRxiv is much lower. Collectively, the other preprint servers are a bit higher at 5.1%. But what this is showing you is that this is very, very far from a normal practice. It is slowly increasing, so this is basically that data, but over time, you can see it kind of hovers around 2 to 3% of preprints that are associated with a non-journal organized peer review. But what's really interesting is that evaluation depends on the preprint server. bioRxiv in particular is interesting because it actually appears to be on a downward trajectory with the percentage of preprints being evaluated there, whereas other servers collectively are actually quite rapidly increasing and going the other way. I'm not yet sure why that is happening, but it's something very interesting to dive into more throughout the next year or so. Across bioRxiv, eLife is by far the biggest preprint evaluation service. It's not a big surprise because of their model switch, but it's worth highlighting that just how big of a difference that is in terms of the rest of the data. It's also really interesting that things like pre-light and pre-review are also very well represented in this data because these are very much community efforts. Arcadia Science is an effort run by a bioscience company, and the fact that they're as prominent as they are is really impressive because this is not part of their business. It's not really what they do. It's a thing they do alongside their work normally. And also shows the power of journal clubs and the impact we could have if we could turn all those journal clubs into preprint review clubs. The speed of the evaluation really depends on the service. What you're seeing here is the delay between preprint posting and the evaluation broken down by the different providers. And basically what you're seeing is the more journal-like the evaluation is, the longer the time delay. This is a table showing you putting the average delay in numbers. But what this suggests is that, again, community-driven efforts are a lot quicker at turning around the evaluation on a preprint than formal processes are. And really big outstanding question here is, do those evaluations differ in their quality? And if they don't, then it raises some really big questions. The other thing that comes out in this data is that evaluators that also are publishers tend to keep most of their evaluations within their journal. So you can see here for PCI, we've got the different PCI communities here. A large number of the evaluations they perform end up being published in the peer community journal. Not all of them, it's about 43%, but it's still quite a big number. Now, eLife was so big that I couldn't show it on a single graph. So eLife has evaluated these preprints, and then for whatever reason, the preprint has gone into a journal that is not eLife. 97% of eLife evaluations are published in eLife. This does represent a bit of a conflict and some questions that we need to ask of the publish, review, create movement, but we'll come back to that. For the non-journal owning evaluators, preprints are published in a wide variety of journals. However, it doesn't matter which the evaluator is, eLife still hugely benefits from these services. So you can see here pre-review, mostly published in eLife and Nature Comms and PLOS One. Review Commons evaluated preprints most often go into eLife and a lot of the PLOS journals. And then with pre-light, it's kind of a similar situation, eLife, PLOS, Nature Communications. We do see the same journals kind of popping up, and these are journals that are quite preprint friendly, so it shows that their policies are working really well in terms of getting preprints published in those journals. So let's take a look at some news, policy developments, and what 2026 is likely to hold. So if you look at big policy developments across 2025 and into 2026, three really stand out. So the Gates Foundation at the beginning of 2025, their new policy took effect, which is that they require preprints and encourage preprint peer review, and that they're also discontinuing fees such as APCs. Following in those footsteps, we have the Navigation Fund and HHMI. So HHMI's policy takes effect from the very beginning of 2026, which is that they now require preprints. They do have a focus on revised preprints, which I think is a bit of a missed opportunity, but they are also discontinuing fees such as APCs. Now, the navigation fund is quite interesting because they don't explicitly require preprints, and yet in many ways they go further than these other two policies do. So the navigation fund requires immediate open sharing rather than traditional journal publications. They also discontinuing things like APCs, but the reason they go further is that they're not allowing their grantees to do things like peer review for traditional journals. And so they're really taking the open approach and expanding it beyond just where you publish and where you share your work. It's how you spend your time and the kind of communities and services that you participate in, which I think is a really interesting approach and is something that I think hopefully others will follow. That takes effect from 2026. So what about the direction of travel across this year? Really, preprinting at the moment is at a bit of a crossroads. We've got lots of competing models that in many ways are exciting, in many other ways threaten to do a lot of damage to the preprinting movement and efforts. We've got traditional publishers, which are very much the wrong approach, in my opinion. We've got publish, review, curate. We've got this broken up publishing idea. So Octopus or DSci are examples here. And then we've got, I call it Pitter, but it's the sort of open constellation type ecosystem, which is very much the one I favor. But let's break this down a little bit. We already know from the data that traditional publishers very much dominate this space. That is changing. However, by dominating the space, this limits the possibilities of experimentation because these servers don't integrate very well with third-party services. The reason they're successful is because they do a very good job of integrating with their own journals. This restricts community governance and community ownership of this movement. And I would expect to see a greater focus on peer review as a quality control step from traditional publishers and journals throughout 2026. The problem with this is that it really does ignore the evidence attesting to preprint quality and the ability of peer review to act as a quality control mechanism. So if we can really focus on the data and the evidence, we might be able to combat that a little bit moving through the next year. Publish, review, curate is a model whereby you publish, so you preprint your work. It is then reviewed by an independent review service and is then curated. Again, it's meant to be an independent service, although proponents will tell you it comes in different flavors to kind of get around that. The big problem with this is that there's still no good curate solution. I do think Diamond Open Access journals might move into that and fill that niche in that space, but that's still, there's not been a big movement on that yet. Some of the really ardent PRC supporters have a very clear conflict of interest, and this data actually, I think, shows that quite well. They very much financially benefit from the model, but they're also failing to generally reflect that separated PRC step. They're much doing P and then the RC together. And by doing that, you could really argue that any journal is already doing that in some degree, because if you preprint and then a journal accepts preprints, which most do, they are doing review and curation. So 97% of eLife evaluations are published in eLife. This is both a sign that the journal's policy is doing a great job, but also it does represent a bit of a potential conflict here. And I think it reflects the fact that for the most part, people are not seeing eLife as a preprint review service, they're seeing it very much still as a journal. PCI is seen slightly differently, and so I think that's why they've got 43% of their evaluations end up in their own journal. And Review Commons is very much a review platform, but it is owned by a publisher. And I think this represents a really good way of how this can work. So 14% of Review Commons evaluations end up in one of the EMBO journals, which is a fair enough number. But by and large, most of those reviews do not. They end up in other journals. And this does reflect this sort of proper, as you would expect to see it, maybe PRC separation. So there is a potential hope here. I just want to show that eLife graph, so you can see that 90% of it really does go to eLife. It's huge. But another big problem with PRC is that it's a very fixed workflow. So this limits experimentation, and it really, really does risk playing into the hands of the publishers, especially because this has such a focus on review and curation, but mainly that review step. Basically, this model works by restricting any kind of assessment of quality to who reviewed it and where it was curated, which again is basically the system we have. It doesn't really make any real meaningful changes to that. You'll see in the report I discuss a little bit of some of the data that actually supports what I've just said there. So there is data looking at some of these models and the quality of the reviews, and basically they've copied over all of the problems with the current reviewing system. So they're not meaningfully improving peer review, they're just doing it a little bit differently. It's important to mention things like eLife do go a little bit further. So their review is not just open whether it's positive or negative, but they put the effort in to make it a bit more usable. That is a good step, I think. And there's not really any data so far that I've seen to suggest how useful that is or not useful yet for the wider research community. But that would be useful information to have as well. And as part of that, it really limits the development of wider trust indicators. And like I said, it keeps ignoring the evidence around the quality of preprints that are not peer reviewed. And also, it really does risk replicating the current system. So DeSci, or broken up publishing, this is a really niche and not well adopted area still. And I think this has a really big likelihood of actually increasing the workload for researchers, because every individual output is still a large amount of work. It's not as simple as you break your paper or article up and put those bits out individually. There's more work doing that than it is having the full package. There's also some really big integrity concerns with some of the DeSci related efforts. And we'll get into this more throughout 2026 because I'm currently investigating this a little bit. But I think this really comes down to the potential here that this model is being pushed a little bit too forcefully without the proper considerations. And what I partially mean by that is a lot of these efforts are being pushed financially, and I'm not sure how sustainable that is, but it also is, as we'll hopefully see when I release what I'm doing later this year, that's leading to some quite perverse incentives that we really do not want to be encouraging. One thing they do really well, though, is discuss provenance. So this is provenance of authors, data, whatever you want. And that is likely to become a much more important topic beyond 2026. And so I think there are a lot of lessons to learn from DeSci's approach in how to maintain and recognize that provenance. Now, this is the consolation system. This is the system I like. This ecosystem really encourages experimentation and author-centric tools. So QED is a really good example. But this does come with that really important thing we mentioned earlier when we talked about licensing. Because this has such a focus on author choice, it needs a significant amount of investment in training, awareness, and advocacy so that authors know how to make informed choices. It's not about telling you what the right choice is, because that's up to the author. It's just about informed choices so that if they choose a closed license, they've done so because there is a genuine need for that rather than they don't understand what it is, so they've just gone for the default. This also represents what I think to be the most impactful effort. It's a genuine opportunity to not just improve publishing, but the entire process. If we start to break things out like this and have this constellation, you can then really focus a lot more on individual data outputs or the context in which it is, maybe that is the peer review efforts or other trust markers. And also this then does lead into very naturally discussions around researcher assessment, and that opens up a whole new kind of things we can play with and really improve. This is what the Pitter model would potentially look like in practice. This is an image stolen from Richard Sever's really good article here that you should probably go and read. So we do the pre-printing stage, which is publishing, and then we have, instead of what the PRCs would call review, I've called integrity and trust. So really this is about focusing on what the authors are doing and how you're working as putting your work out there. And then on the trust angle, which is really about the reader. That reader could be, a news reporter, it could be a member of the general public, it could also be other scientists, it could be people sat on grant panels who need help to really understand how to trust an article without just relying on journal name or peer review presence. And then we've got the assessment step, which comes after all of it, which really does allow us to change how we're assessing it. And the reason this is embedded in the model is because I think you can't change any of those other things unless you also do it alongside changing the assessment side. Importantly, this really should be scholar-led. It does not mean we ignore the expertise of everyone else, but it's basically meaning that we really focus in on what researchers need and want rather than what we're trying to focus over onto them. Because one of the big problems a lot of these movements have, and one of the reasons a lot of them fail, is they force things on researchers that researchers don't want. It's really important to maintain connections and honest connections with average researchers who will tell you that, yes, this might be a brilliant idea, but it's never going to work because they don't want to do it for whatever reason. That's actually really useful feedback. So looking ahead to 2026, I think PRC will be a really big focus and discussion point. It's vital that this is not one-sided and that we do bring in some of the evidence to talk about the downsides to this. My experience so far, the PRC movement, is that if you speak up against it, they push you out a bit. So that will be interesting to monitor and see across 2026. There's also going to be an increasing recognition for preprint in hiring, promotion, and graduation. We are seeing this already. I've talked about some of the policy changes, but we are starting to see a much greater effort around the top-down approaches. They cannot be done alone because you force compliance, you don't result in meaningful changes, but it is an important step of that change. There's a really good opportunity across 2026 to expand trust signals, really moving beyond peer review and looking at what else we can use to signify trust in any given output, whether that's a bit of data or a full article. There's also been a loss of community throughout sort of the latter half of 2025, and I think this is going to continue in 2026. This loss of community and loss of community focus represents a really big opportunity for someone else to come in and fill that gap, but it also represents a huge threat to the preprint adoption because that is how it's achieved or largely been achieved so far. And given that I've talked so much about advocacy and training and all those things, this represents a significant challenge across the next year. And there is a clear need for advocacy. That's what I think this data most shows. But that advocacy really does need to come from an authentic, trusted experts who have the appropriate experience and background. You need to, if you're talking to life scientists, you need a life science background so that you can really understand why they would adopt something versus not something else. Academia is not the same across fields, so that I think that really is an important part of it. Authenticity is also becoming a huge thing, not just in this space, but in trust and advocacy more broadly. That's becoming the thing that people are most likely to go to when they want someone to trust. It's someone they view as authentic. A lot of the previous actors no longer fit this space, or at least these definitions. And so I think the time now is really right for much clearer direction. And now is probably a good time to make preprints a better alternative to publishing, not just an addition to the process. And by that, I mean really look at making the preprint something that people want to use, not just because it's easy, but because they get something out of it. And I don't mean, you get more citations and stuff like that. I mean, you get more out of it as a reader. So maybe it's embedded data, maybe it's some of the really cool curve note stuff that's going on. There's a lot of things we can do there, and a lot of experiments we can try to see what would work and what wouldn't work. But I think that's a really big opportunity for the next year as well. And as part of this report, I also have some advocacy recommendations. We do need a renewed effort in basic advocacy. And what I mean by that is going out and talking to people, meeting people where they are. A lot of people seem to think that's done now, but I think the data here is very clear that we're very far from that being done. And it's the boring stuff that people don't like to continue funding for a long period of time. But that is, if we're going to have success with wider adoption of preprints, that is the key. We need that. There's also a recommendation here to form a new community for preprint advocates. I think it would be good to wrap that up with some of the other things, so trust in research and also that wider academic culture angle. Wrapping those all up together, I think, has the great potential to move towards more meaningful change. We also desperately need to increase the number of ERCA researchers, Global South research, and just general diversity of board members. We do see the same faces popping up at the same meetings and the same boards, and that is harmful to the movement as a whole. Diversity of voices is always a good thing, and I think we do need to do a much better job as a field of bringing those voices in. I would also recommend the formation of a coalition to bring together organisations that support the constellation model. In part, this is to make sure that we are moving together on this rather than just individual actors sort of playing their own part in this. But also this represents a possibility to make a new community that is embedded within this kind of thinking. I also strongly recommend we do move toward meaningful change rather than replicating the same problems. There's been a lot of concerns I've had from conversations I've had with researchers where they complain about open science and open access movements because they're just replicating the problems. Someone said recently that they hate the movement because we're just making more work for people. And we get around that by making real change that is beneficial, not just replicating some of the problems over to a slightly different model. We also really need to make sure that the things we recommend are embedded in evidence. If it's not evidence driven, we shouldn't be doing it. And if the evidence says it's not working, we should really stop doing it. I appreciate how hard that is, especially when people build their reputations and careers around a particular thing. But we're supposed to be scientists. We should be led by evidence. And we should also very strongly welcome and encourage dissenting opinion and views, because this is how we make the efforts we're doing the best they possibly can be, by making sure we have constructive discussions within those spaces before we release anything out to the wider space and public. So there's been a bunch of new resources from us this year that I figure this is an opportunity to highlight. So we most recently released a Zotera library for basically everything that I can find around preprint evidence. So if you advocate for preprints, I recommend joining this library. It is going to be updated as and when I come across new articles that have evidence on preprint use. This isn't just a one-way thing. If it's a bad thing, then if it's a negative part of preprint use, that will still be included in this data set. This is to really provide a good, solid evidence base for anything preprint related. We've also got directories. So we've got the preprint server directory. We've got preprint review services. You can go and look at those on the website. We've been doing a lot more YouTube stuff, and we've got a bunch of whiteboard explainers. We're going to be doing more videos like this as well coming up. We've put a few guides together. We've got a few more coming. We've got a guide for new PIs, although even if you're not a new PI, still applies, on how to promote open science and really embed preprints in your lab from the very beginning. We've got a guide on running and converting journal clubs into preprint review clubs, and a more broad guide on just how to get started on Blue Sky, which, if you remember the old metric data, this is the sort of current place for science. We're also developing some best practice guidelines. So we've got one already out on how best to use AI for the preprint peer review services, working on a few of these for authors as well. The podcast Preprints in Motion is still very much ongoing, currently having a little break for a couple of months, but we created a new format last year, which was sort of 20-minute topical discussions. Since starting, we produced about 50 hours of content, and we have started to expand into video clips on YouTube in 2025, and that will hopefully grow over the next year or so. So some of the key takeaways. Preprint adoption is growing at a fairly steady pace, and it's increasing each year. But the evaluation of preprints remains extremely low. Community efforts are on track to overtake traditional publishers within the next few years, and I think this is a really good thing for the space. And community-friendly publishers are leading the efforts such as PRC, which might threaten standalone preprinting efforts. And I think we do need to maybe view PRC as a publisher-led effort, not a community effort. But these are the nicer publishers, so there's a much bigger discussion to have there. There's a really big change in focus and a loss of community in the preprint space since sort of mid-2025. I'm hoping that will reverse and someone else will step in to fill those gaps, but that is a really big threat that we do need to be very aware of. It also represents an enormous opportunity across the year. But the key takeaway for me is that it really is vital that we have renewed efforts around preprint advocacy that are stronger, more direct, and more authentic than we've had in the past. Now preprints are an established thing. They're not going to go anywhere. So it's really time to take that and charge forward with it a little bit. So thank you for listening to what I assume was quite a long talk. Extra thanks to Ted Roder at Open Archive for helping with API access and a lot of troubleshooting I was having, and also Richard Sever for feedback on an earlier draft of the report. You can download the report using the QR link or the link up here, and you can get me all over the place. I would recommend signing up to our newsletter and YouTube. And if you want slide decks for anything else we've done as part of an organization, you can also find that over on Zenodo. Slides and data and report are all provided under a CC BY or CC BY SA license. You are free to use these as long as you provide the appropriate attribution.